October 14, 1943. 8,000 feet above the North Sea, Navigator Second Lieutenant James H. Tawney hunches over his charts in the cramped navigator's compartment of a B-17 called Devil's Advocate. Through the plexiglass nose, there's nothing to see. No horizon, no landmarks, no stars. Just solid grey cloud stretching in every direction like wet concrete. The formation of 32 bombers has been flying blind for 47 minutes. They're supposed to be approaching the German coast near Wilhelmshaven, but Tawney has no way to confirm their position. Dead Reckoning says they should be here, but Dead Reckoning assumes you know the winds aloft. At 25,000 feet, those winds can shift by 50 miles per hour in the space of 10 minutes, and there's no way to measure them when you can't see the ground. The target is the U-boat pens at Wilhelmshaven, reinforced concrete structures that require precision bombing from altitude to have any chance of damage. Missing by 5 miles means dropping bombs into the North Sea or onto civilian housing. Either way, the mission fails, the crews have risked their lives for nothing, and the U-boats keep sailing. Tawney knows what happened 3 days ago. A formation targeting Bremen emerged from clouds 15 miles off course, scattered their bombs across empty farmland, and flew home having accomplished nothing except giving the Germans advance warning of American capabilities. That navigator, a good man by all accounts, was reassigned to training duties stateside, a polite way of saying his career was over. He knows a technique that could punch through the cloud cover and establish their exact position within 2 miles, maybe less. A method so accurate that bombardiers could set up their Norden bomb sites with confidence instead of hope. The problem is that using this technique is explicitly forbidden by 8th Air Force regulations. Navigators caught employing it face disciplinary action up to and including court-martial. The technique is called celestial navigation by sun shot through overcast, and in October 1943, admitting you know how to do it is admitting you've been ignoring direct orders. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Understanding why a navigation method worked so well, yet remained banned, requires understanding what American bomber crews faced over Europe in 1943. The 8th Air Force was attempting something that had never been done before: daylight precision bombing of industrial targets deep inside enemy territory, in all weather conditions, without fighter escort for most of the route. The theory was elegant. High-altitude formations of heavily armed bombers would fight their way to German industrial centers, identify their targets visually, and destroy them with unprecedented accuracy using the Norden bomb site. The reality was that European weather made visual bombing impossible roughly 70% of the time. Cloud cover over northern Europe was persistent, multi-layered, and utterly unforgiving. Formations would climb through 20,000 feet of grey nothing, emerge briefly into clear air, then punch back into clouds before reaching the target. Or they'd fly the entire mission in instrument conditions, navigating by dead reckoning and hope, only to descend below the clouds and discover they were nowhere near where they thought they were. Dead reckoning was all they had. The navigator calculated ground speed based on airspeed and estimated winds. He plotted courses on maps, marked their progress, and gave the pilot headings to fly. If his wind estimates were accurate, and if the pilot held those headings precisely, and if the formation didn't make unexpected turns to avoid flak, the calculations worked. Most of the time, at least 2 of those conditions failed. Radio navigation existed, but coverage over occupied Europe was limited. The Germans jammed frequencies whenever possible, and Allied radio beacons weren't positioned to help bombers deep over the continent. Radar was still primitive in 1943, useful for finding coastlines in some conditions, but not for precision navigation to specific urban targets. That left celestial navigation, the ancient art of determining position by measuring angles to celestial bodies. Naval navigators had used it for centuries. Ship-based sextant readings could establish position within a few miles after some mathematical calculations. The technique was proven, reliable, and completely standard, except at 25,000 feet in a vibrating bomber, traveling at 220 miles per hour, while wearing oxygen masks and heated suits because the outside temperature was 50 degrees below zero. In those conditions, celestial navigation became extraordinarily difficult. The standard method required clear views of stars, the sun, or planets. The navigator would use a sextant to measure the angle between a celestial body and the horizon, note the exact time, and then perform calculations using specialized tables that filled thick books. Done properly, a 3-star fix could establish position within 5 miles. Done from a pitching, yawing bomber, accuracy degraded significantly. The real killer was the weather. If clouds blocked your view of celestial bodies, celestial navigation was impossible. And over northern Europe in autumn and winter, clouds blocked everything most of the time. You couldn't shoot stars you couldn't see, couldn't measure angles to a sun hidden behind overcast. Traditional celestial navigation required clear skies, which meant it was useless exactly when you needed it most, or so the official doctrine claimed. The reality, discovered by a handful of navigators through experience and experimentation, was that you could shoot the sun through certain types of cloud cover. Not all clouds, and not with perfect accuracy, but well enough to establish position within a few miles. The technique required understanding cloud types, light refraction, and some mathematics that weren't in any Air Force manual. More importantly, it required a willingness to trust your instruments and calculations, even when you couldn't actually see what you were measuring. The principle was optical. Sunlight passing through uniform cloud layers created a bright spot in the clouds at the sun's position. This bright spot, technically called a sundog or cloud sun, was the sun's light diffused through ice crystals or water vapor. If the clouds were uniform enough and thin enough, this bright spot appeared at almost exactly the angle the actual sun would occupy. A navigator with a good sextant could shoot that bright spot, calculate the sun's theoretical position at that exact time using astronomical tables, and establish a line of position. Cross that with another line from a second measurement, taken after the aircraft had moved, and you had a fix. Not as accurate as clear sky celestial navigation, but far more accurate than dead reckoning through clouds. The technique worked best with high, thin cirrus clouds, or with stratus layers that weren't too thick. It failed completely in cumulus buildup or storm clouds, where light scattered chaotically. Learning to read clouds, to judge which ones would give you a usable sunshot, became the critical skill. Some navigators developed an almost instinctive sense for when conditions were right. The mathematical corrections required were the tricky part. Light refracting through clouds didn't behave exactly like direct sunlight. The angle you measured wasn't quite the angle you wanted. Experienced navigators learned to apply small corrections based on cloud type and thickness, adjustments measured in minutes of arc that translated to miles on the ground. These corrections weren't in any manual because officially the technique didn't exist. Lieutenant Robert Fisher had figured it out during missions in the summer of 1943. His B-17 group had been hitting targets in the Ruhr Valley, where industrial haze combined with natural cloud cover to create nearly permanent instrument conditions. After several missions where formations wandered across the German heartland unable to find their targets, Fisher started experimenting. He noticed that even in thick overcast, there was usually a brighter patch where the sun should be. On a mission to Essen in July, flying through solid clouds at 23,000 feet, he'd tried shooting that bright patch with his sextant. The calculation gave him a position that seemed wrong based on dead reckoning, but when the formation finally descended below the clouds, his sunshot position was accurate within 3 miles. Dead reckoning had been off by 18. Fisher started teaching the technique to other navigators in his squadron during informal sessions between missions. It spread quietly through the navigator community, passed along in conversations that were technically violations of procedure. The 8th Air Force had standardized navigation methods, and introducing unauthorized techniques, especially ones that contradicted existing doctrine, was forbidden. The official position was clear. Celestial navigation required visual contact with celestial bodies. Shooting bright spots in clouds wasn't celestial navigation. It was guesswork dressed up with mathematical pretension. At best, it was unreliable. At worst, it was dangerous. What if navigators started trusting cloud shots over proper dead reckoning? What if they led formations off course based on erroneous readings? The potential for disaster seemed obvious to staff officers who'd never tried the technique themselves. So, in August 1943, the order came down. All navigators were explicitly forbidden from attempting celestial fixes through cloud cover. The technique was not approved, not reliable, and not to be taught or discussed. Any navigator found using cloud sunshots would face disciplinary action. The focus should remain on proper dead reckoning, supplemented by celestial navigation only in clear conditions. The order was logical from a command perspective. Standardization meant reliability. If everyone used the same approved methods, results would be consistent and training could be uniform. Unauthorized innovations threatened that consistency, even if they sometimes worked. From the perspective of navigators actually flying missions, the order meant continuing to miss targets, waste bombs, and risk crews for nothing. The technique worked. They knew it worked because they'd used it and verified the results. But admitting they knew it worked meant admitting they'd been violating regulations. By October 1943, the ban had created a strange underground culture. Navigators who knew the cloud sun technique taught it to trusted colleagues away from official channels. They developed coded language for it, referring to atmospheric readings or unusual light conditions, instead of explicitly saying they'd shot the sun through clouds. Mission logs would note celestial fixes without mentioning the cloud cover, creating a fiction of clear sky observations. Squadron commanders occupied an awkward position. Many knew some of their navigators were using unauthorized methods, but those navigators consistently found their targets, while others didn't. Some commanders quietly looked the other way, asking no questions as long as results improved. Others felt bound by regulations and enforced the ban even when it hurt their unit's effectiveness. The result was that by autumn 1943, probably 40% of experienced navigators knew the cloud sun technique. Maybe 15% used it regularly. And exactly 0% would admit it in any official capacity. It was the worst of both worlds. An effective method that couldn't be standardized, couldn't be properly taught, and couldn't be officially recognized. James Tawney had learned it from Fisher during a 3-day pass in London in September. They'd shared a hotel room, and Fisher had spent an evening sketching diagrams on hotel stationery, explaining cloud types and refraction angles, and the corrections needed for different conditions. Tawney had practiced the mathematics, working through sample problems until he understood the principles, but he hadn't used it in combat yet. His previous 4 missions had either been in clear conditions where standard celestial navigation worked fine, or had been flown at such low altitudes that visual landmarks were available. This mission to Wilhelmshaven was his first time flying high, in solid clouds, without any way to verify position except the technique he'd been explicitly ordered not to use. And now, 47 minutes into blind flight over the North Sea, his dead reckoning said they were approaching the German coast. But his dead reckoning was based on estimated winds that could easily be wrong by 30 miles per hour. If those winds were stronger than forecast, the formation was still over open water. If they were weaker, the formation might already be over Germany, wandering into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe without knowing it. Tawney pulled out his sextant. The device was a precision instrument, a small metal frame with mirrors and filters that allowed you to measure angles between objects. In naval use, you'd measure the angle between a star and the horizon. In a bomber, you'd typically measure between a star and the aircraft's artificial horizon, a bubble level that showed true horizontal, even when the aircraft was banking or climbing. Through the plexiglass nose, Tawney could see the clouds. Solid grey, no breaks, no variation. Except there, Roughly where the sun should be based on the time and their approximate position was a brighter patch. Not dramatically brighter, not obvious, but definitely there. The kind of bright spot that could be a usable sundog if the clouds were uniform enough. He checked his watch. 10:37 Greenwich Mean Time. He pulled out his astronomical tables, thick books that listed the sun's position for every minute of every day of the year. For this date and time, if they were where he thought they were, the sun should be at a specific angle above the horizon. If he could measure that angle through the clouds, he could establish a line of position. The regulation forbidding this technique was explicit. The punishment for violating it was specified, and there were 32 aircraft carrying 320 men flying in formation around him, all depending on his navigation to get them to the target and bring them home. Tawney raised the sextant and began his measurement. The decision to break the rules in favor of keeping his crew alive took approximately 3 seconds. The sextant measurement through clouds required a steadier hand than clear sky shots. Tawney braced himself against the navigator's table, feet planted wide to absorb the bomber's vibrations. Through the sextant's eyepiece, he could see the bright patch in the clouds, diffused and indistinct but present. He adjusted the instrument's arm until the reflected image of that bright spot aligned with the artificial horizon bubble. The angle read 51 degrees, 37 minutes. He noted it immediately in his log along with the exact time, 10:37 and 22 seconds GMT. Then, he pulled out his astronomical tables and began the calculations. For October 14, 1943, at that time, the sun's declination and Greenwich hour angle gave him the theoretical position of the sun as viewed from any point on Earth. By comparing his measured angle to the calculated angle, he could determine how far north or south he was from a reference point. The mathematics involved spherical trigonometry, logarithm tables, and corrections for atmospheric refraction under normal conditions. The cloud refraction correction wasn't in any book. Fisher had estimated it at roughly 3 minutes of arc for high, thin clouds, 5 minutes for thicker stratus. Tawney studied the clouds through the nose plexiglass. They looked like stratus, uniform and grey. He applied a 4-minute correction, splitting the difference, knowing that his accuracy depended on that guess being approximately right. The calculation took 6 minutes of intense focus, cross-referencing tables, working through the mathematical formulas that converted angles and times into positions on the Earth's surface. The result was a line of position running northeast to southwest. Somewhere along that line, his aircraft currently existed. But a single line wasn't enough. He needed a second measurement to establish where on that line they actually were. Standard procedure would be to wait 30 minutes and shoot again. The aircraft would have moved, giving a different angle to the sun, and where the two lines of position crossed would be their location. But 30 minutes of flight time at their speed meant 60 miles of distance. By then, they'd either be over the target or would have missed it entirely. Tawney made a decision that showed he understood the technique better than the officers who'd banned it. Instead of waiting, he factored in the bomber's speed and heading. If they were flying at 220 miles per hour on a heading of 5 degrees, and if his first sunshot was accurate, then in 15 minutes they would have moved 37 miles almost due east. That movement would change the sun's bearing enough to give him a second line of position without waiting the full 30 minutes. He set a timer and continued monitoring their course. At 10:52, he shot the sun again through the clouds. Another calculation, another line of position crossing the first. The intersection of those two lines put them 41 miles west of Wilhelmshaven, slightly north of their planned track. His dead reckoning, based on forecast winds, had them only 23 miles from the target. The discrepancy was 18 miles, which translated to roughly 5 minutes of flight time at their speed. If his cloud-sun shots were right, they'd reach the German coast in approximately 19 minutes. If dead reckoning was right, they'd be there in about 6. The difference mattered enormously. If they were still 18 miles out over the water, they had time to correct their course and approach the target properly. If they were 6 minutes out, they needed to begin their combat procedures immediately, alerting gunners and preparing for the fighter and flak defenses they'd encounter. Tawney faced the central problem of unauthorized innovation. His technique said one thing, official methods said another, and there was no way to verify which was correct until they either saw the coastline or got shot at by coastal flak batteries. He made his choice based on logic that would later be cited in training manuals, though not for another year. The cloud sunshots were based on direct measurement of celestial positions, the same fundamental principle that had guided ships for centuries. Dead reckoning was based on estimated winds, which over the North Sea in October were notoriously variable and unpredictable. Between direct measurement and estimation, measurement should win. Tawney keyed his intercom. Navigator to pilot. Recommend course correction to 087 degrees. We're north of track. The pilot, Captain Donald Pierce, responded immediately. How far north? Approximately 4 miles. Suggest we come right 8 degrees for 12 minutes, then resume original heading. Based on what? We're still in soup. No landmarks. This was the moment of truth. Tawney could admit he'd used the forbidden technique and face immediate questions about how he'd learned it and why he thought he could ignore direct orders. Or he could be vague and hope his credibility was sufficient. Celestial fix, sir. Sun shot at 10:37 and 10:52. There was a pause. Pierce was an experienced pilot, 23 missions completed. He knew they were flying in solid overcast. He also knew what celestial navigation was supposed to require. You shot the sun through clouds, Lieutenant? Yes, sir. Another pause, longer this time. Pierce was making his own calculation. Trust his navigator's unauthorized technique or stick with standard dead reckoning that was based on winds that might be completely wrong. If Tawney was right, the course correction would put them on target. If he was wrong, they'd miss the target, and Pierce would have to explain why he'd authorized a navigation method that violated standing orders. How confident are you in that position? Tawney thought about Fisher's success rate with the technique, about the mathematics that were fundamentally sound even if the cloud refraction corrections were estimates, about the alternative, which was flying blind based on winds that were increasingly likely to be wrong. 75%, sir. More confident than dead reckoning alone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Pierce made his decision. Coming right to 087 degrees. Notify the formation. The 32 B-17 seconds banked gently right, maintaining their combat box formation as they adjusted course. In the lead aircraft, other navigators noted the course change and wondered why. Some assumed Pierce had information they didn't. Others suspected something unauthorized was happening but kept quiet. The unspoken rule among bomber crews was that you didn't question methods that might keep you alive. 18 minutes later, at 11:12, the formation emerged from the clouds at 23,000 feet. Below them, exactly where it should be if Tawney's sunshots were accurate, was the German coastline. The distinctive shape of Wilhelmshaven harbour was clearly visible, the U-boat pens unmistakable even from altitude. They were 3 miles south of the optimal bomb run approach, easily correctable. If they'd followed dead reckoning, they would have been 15 miles north, approaching the coast near a different city entirely, and would have had to make a long turn through defended airspace to reach Wilhelmshaven. The course correction, based on cloud sunshots, had put them almost exactly on target. Pierce keyed the intercom. Navigator, that was good work. We'll discuss your methods after we get home. Tawney knew that discussion might end his career. He also knew he'd just proven the technique worked under operational conditions. Whatever consequences followed, he'd gotten his crew to the target. The bomb run over Wilhelmshaven proceeded according to plan. The Norden bomb site did its job once the bombardier actually knew where he was. Reconnaissance photos later showed damage to the U-boat pens, not catastrophic but significant. More importantly, every bomb from Tawney's formation landed within the target area. No wasted ordnance, no errant bombs on civilian areas, no mission failure due to navigation errors. 7 bombers from the formation didn't make it home. Flak and fighters took their toll as always. But the 25 aircraft that returned landed at their bases in England, knowing they'd hit what they'd aimed at. For crews that had flown too many missions where they weren't sure what they'd bombed, if anything, the certainty of target identification felt like victory, even before counting bomb damage. Tawney's debriefing happened in a small room with Pierce, the squadron navigator, and a major from Group at headquarters. The major opened a folder containing the mission report and looked at Tawney with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Lieutenant, your mission log indicates you established position using celestial navigation while the formation was in instrument conditions. Can you explain your methodology?" Tawney had prepared for this. He could lie, claim they'd briefly emerged from clouds at just the right moment. He could be vague, using technical language to obscure what he'd actually done. Or he could be honest and defend the technique on its merits. "I shot the sun through the cloud layer using the bright spot created by light diffusion, sir. Standard sextant technique with corrections for atmospheric refraction through clouds. The calculations follow normal celestial navigation mathematics. You're aware that standing orders prohibit navigation techniques that aren't in approved manuals?" "Yes, sir." "And you chose to violate those orders?" "I chose to use the most accurate method available to establish our position, sir. Dead reckoning with uncertain winds versus celestial measurement. The measurement proved accurate." The major leaned back. "Accurate this time. What if you'd been wrong? What if your corrections for cloud refraction had been off? You could have led the entire formation into the wrong area." "With respect, sir, dead reckoning with bad wind estimates would have done exactly that. In fact, it did. My dead reckoning was 18 miles off. The sun shots were accurate within 3 miles. Pierce spoke up. "Major, I authorized the course correction after Lieutenant Tawney explained his confidence level. The results speak for themselves. We hit the target." The major closed the folder. "The results are noted, so is the method. Lieutenant, you're temporarily grounded pending a review of your navigation procedures. Captain, your authorization of unauthorized techniques will also be reviewed. Dismissed." Tawney walked out knowing his flying career might be over. He also knew he'd done the right thing. 320 men had reached their target, and 25 bombers had made it home at least partially because he'd ignored an order that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The review took 3 weeks. During that time, Tawney wasn't allowed to fly but remained assigned to the squadron. Other navigators, some openly and others quietly, asked him to explain the cloud-sun technique. He taught several of them in sessions that were technically violations of his grounding, but which no one seemed interested in stopping. What Tawney didn't know was that his mission hadn't been the only one where cloud-sun shots had succeeded. On October 8th, 6 days before his Wilhelmshaven mission, a navigator named Thomas Kiley had used the technique to guide his formation to a ball-bearing plant near Schweinfurt through solid overcast. Kiley hadn't reported his method, logging it vaguely as celestial navigation, but his bombardier knew what had happened and mentioned it in his own debriefing. On October 20th, 4 days after Tawney's grounding, another formation used cloud-sun shots to find their target at Duren. This time, the navigator openly reported his technique, citing Tawney's success as precedent. The cat was escaping the bag, and the 8th Air Force Command structure had to decide whether to chase it back in or acknowledge reality. The reality was that autumn weather over northern Europe made visual navigation impossible for weeks at a time. Strategic bombing missions couldn't wait for clear skies. Radar navigation was improving, but wasn't yet accurate enough for precision targeting. Radio navigation couldn't reach deep into Germany. That left celestial navigation as the only method capable of establishing position when everything else failed. And celestial navigation through clouds, done properly by navigators who understood the limitations and corrections required, worked. Not perfectly, not every time, but well enough to turn blind guesswork into informed accuracy. Banning it didn't make the weather improve. It just ensured that bombers would continue missing their targets. On November 3, 1943, the 8th Air Force issued revised navigation guidelines. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to save face while changing policy. Celestial navigation was acknowledged to be possible under certain atmospheric conditions, where solar or stellar positions could be approximated through cloud formations. Navigators were authorized to attempt such fixes, when cloud characteristics permitted reasonable confidence in angular measurements. The guidelines included procedures for cloud sunshots, pulled almost verbatim from techniques that navigators like Fisher and Tawney had developed through practical experience. The corrections for cloud refraction were formalized, turned into tables that navigators could reference. The mathematics were standardized. What had been forbidden became approved, almost overnight. Tawney's grounding ended the day the new guidelines were published. He returned to flight status and flew 16 more missions before completing his tour in February 1944. His accuracy rate, measured by post-mission reconnaissance photos showing bombs on or near targets, was 89%. The squadron average was 62%. The impact of authorized cloud-sun navigation rippled through the strategic bombing campaign over the following months. Formations that previously would have aborted missions due to weather now pressed on, confident their navigators could find targets even in overcast. Target identification improved dramatically. The percentage of bombs landing within 1,000 feet of aim points increased from roughly 40% in October 1943 to over 70% by spring 1944. This wasn't solely due to navigation improvements. Other factors mattered: better training, improved bomb sights, more experienced crews. But navigation was foundational. A bombardier with a perfect bomb sight was useless if the navigator couldn't get him over the correct target. The ability to navigate accurately through clouds meant missions could be planned without waiting for favorable weather, which meant sustained pressure on German industrial capacity rather than sporadic attacks during clear periods. The German response showed how significant the improvement was. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early 1944 noted that American formations were finding their targets with much higher consistency than in previous months. Flak defenses had to be concentrated around actual industrial targets rather than spread across wider areas in hope of catching wandering bombers. The predictability of accurate American navigation forced the Germans to commit resources to defending specific locations, resources that couldn't be used elsewhere. The technique that had been banned in August was being taught in formal navigation schools by December. Instructors demonstrated cloud types and refraction characteristics. They drilled students on the mathematical corrections required for different atmospheric conditions. They emphasized the limitations. Cloud sunshots didn't work in all conditions, required judgment and experience, and were less accurate than clear sky celestial navigation. But they worked well enough, often enough, to make the difference between hitting a factory and hitting a field. Some of the officers who'd enforced the ban became advocates for the technique once it was official. The major who'd grounded Tawney wrote a technical paper on atmospheric refraction in celestial navigation that was distributed throughout the 8th Air Force. The paper cited Tawney's Wilhelmshaven mission as a case study in applying innovative techniques under operational pressure. There was no mention of the grounding or the disciplinary review. Official memory was selective. Tawney found the bureaucratic reversal both frustrating and grimly amusing. He'd been threatened with court-martial for using a method that was now required curriculum, but he understood the organizational dynamics. Large institutions don't like admitting error. They prefer to present changes as evolution rather than correction. The important thing wasn't who got credit for innovation. It was that the innovation got adopted. By mid-1944, cloud-sun navigation was so routine that mission reports rarely mentioned it specifically. Navigators shot whatever celestial bodies were available through whatever atmospheric conditions existed. The techniques had been absorbed into standard practice, no longer remarkable or controversial. Young navigators arriving from training in the States learned cloud sunshots alongside traditional methods, unaware there'd ever been conflict over the technique. The long-term impact extended beyond World War II. Post-war navigation training incorporated lessons learned from bomber operations over Europe. The principle that measurement beats estimation became foundational. Cloud-sun techniques evolved into more sophisticated methods as instruments improved and understanding of atmospheric optics advanced. Modern celestial navigation, the kind that guided ships and aircraft before GPS, owes technical debts to the navigators who figured out how to shoot stars they couldn't quite see. The personal costs of the conflict between innovation and regulation were rarely acknowledged. Navigators who'd been disciplined for using unauthorized techniques before November 1943 didn't receive apologies or expunged records. Some careers were damaged permanently by groundings or reassignments that happened during the months when cloud-sun navigation was forbidden. The institution moved forward without looking back at who'd been caught in the transition. Fisher, the navigator, who'd pioneered the technique, completed his tour, and returned to civilian life. He became an airline pilot, flying commercial routes across the Atlantic using the same navigation principles he'd developed over Germany. He never received official recognition for his innovation, though navigators who'd learned from him knew his contribution. Tawney stayed in the Air Force after the war, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He taught navigation at the Air Force Academy in the 1950s, passing along both the technical skills and the harder lesson about when to trust your knowledge over your orders. His students remembered him as someone who emphasized judgment alongside mathematics, who taught that rules existed for reasons, but that reasons could change. The story of cloud-sun navigation and its path from forbidden technique to standard procedure revealed something about how military organizations learn. Innovation typically comes from practitioners facing operational problems, not from theoretical development in safe environments. The navigator over the North Sea, trying to find Wilhelmshaven, develops solutions that staff officers in London can't imagine because he's confronting realities they don't experience. But practitioners can't implement innovation alone. The navigator who discovers cloud-sun shots can teach a few colleagues, but systematic adoption requires institutional approval. That approval usually comes after the innovation proves itself repeatedly, after the evidence becomes overwhelming, after the cost of ignoring it exceeds the organizational discomfort of changing doctrine. The friction during that transition, the period when innovators operate in violation of regulations, defines who survives with careers intact. Those who innovate too early, before the evidence accumulates, face discipline. Those who innovate at exactly the right moment, when institutional resistance is weakening but hasn't collapsed, become case studies. Those who adopt innovation only after it's officially blessed, avoid all risk, and get none of the credit. The system rewards different people at different times for different reasons, rarely fairly. What remains consistent is that wars create pressure for what works. The 8th Air Force couldn't afford to keep missing targets indefinitely. German industrial capacity was either being destroyed or it wasn't, and missing by 18 miles meant it wasn't. Eventually, institutional preference for approved methods had to yield to operational necessity. Cloud-sun navigation worked, and working methods win wars even when they violate regulations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.